everyone, and welcome to The Download, where we bring you discussion and analysis from a Catholic perspective. Today's Tuesday, May the 30th, 2023. I'm Simon Rafe, here with my two co-hosts, Brad Eli and Christine Niles. Always good to have the old guard back. And joining us today as a guest, old guard, that's kind of... Elderly, mature, yeah, seasoned, something like that. Anyway, joining us as a guest host is the very young and handsome Nick Wiley. Hey there, Nick, how you doing?
Thanks, Simon. Appreciate it.
Good man. Relics. I'm a Catholic, and so I see dead people. Pieces of the bodily remains of a saint, or things that have touched the body of a saint. Relics play an important part in Catholic devotional life. And to start things off today, we're going to be talking with one of our reporters, the ineffable and wonderful Dr. William Mahoney, about the body of a deceased nun in Missouri that many believe is incorrupt. Hey, William, tell us more about this wonderful story.
Hi, we covered this last week. I think we were one of the first, if not the first, to do that because we had people on the ground in Missouri telling us about that. This was last week. I think it was Monday of last week. So they exhumed her body. She's Sister Wilhelmina of the Most Holy Rosary, and they exhumed. She's the foundress of the order there, which are Benedictines of Mary, Queen of the Apostles. So when they exhumed her to put her in another place, were working on building an altar for her, the St. Joseph altar. They discovered that she was remarkably intact. Mm-hmm. What was most impressive was that she wasn't embalmed. She was buried in 2019 at the age of 95, and they found a substrate of water underneath the coffin. I don't know how much of it was submerged in there, but it was definitely underneath it. And because of that, the interior of the simple wooden coffin had completely deteriorated, but her habit was completely intact, and her face, her skin's there, and she's just looks to be incorrupt. So that's what happened there. And then yesterday, they translated her body to and put it in a glass case with a picture of St. Joseph holding the Christ child. Little shrine there, and they've had pilgrims coming, like so many pilgrims. So yesterday when they did this, I think there was like 1,500, maybe more people there. The town that it's in, Gow, was only like 1,500 people. I saw that when since this happened, they've had 15,000 visitors. So, police and all have been helping too with all of this influx of pilgrims. So that's what's going on. Wow.
Well, I guess Missouri loves company. But obviously, one of the most interesting things about this, and you just kind of mention it, and I want to make sure the audience appreciates it, that she wasn't embalmed. And that, of course, is common practice for bodies in the United States. Not always that they are embalmed, but embalming, of course, will preserve the body for a long time. But without embalming, bodies will just start to decay within a week or a few days or something like that. So this is really quite amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Skeletization takes 3 weeks to 3 years, and depending on climate and all. Like you said, if you're not embalmed, that happens quite quickly, especially with all the Missouri summers that pass and everything else, just in a simple wooden coffin and water there. I mean, other things really add to very quick skeletization. So. Yeah, well, I'm not going to ask the guy from New Jersey how he knows how long it takes for a body to turn into a skeleton. I'm going to let Brad talk to you now, I think.
William, you were mentioning the material inside of the coffin was deteriorated, all the cloth and all that. But the material of the habit that she was wearing, that was not corrupt in any way?
That's correct, yeah. You can see her. She's on display in the habit that she was buried in.
That's interesting, because what we call a first-class relic, of course, is the body itself of the saint. And then something that touches the body that they've used, that they've lived in, or used when they were alive as a second-class relic. So this is kind of a proof, then, that there's something special about what we would call a second-class relic in the church, then.
Definitely, yeah. If indeed this is a miracle, which I personally think it is, but we have to wait for the church to do an investigation and comment, and to decide on that matter. But definitely, this is God covering, relics number 1 and 2.
Huh, so. That's interesting. Thank you.
I wanted to ask for your response. I know there have been a handful of critics who are trying to downplay the miraculous nature of this discovery by claiming that there's actually a wax mask over her face, which my understanding is that's actually pretty common with a lot of incorrupt saints, because the skin tends to darken after they wash it, and so they put this wax mask to sort of protect the skin. And but I know the nuns, as they were transferring her body from the casket and lifting it up, they said that she still weighed quite a bit, like something like 90 pounds, which obviously, I mean, can you respond to that? Does that really impact the miraculous nature of this discovery?
I think absolutely. I mean, I have to say, to Simon's point, I don't have a lot of experience handling dead bodies, but that being said, yeah, I don't think you're supposed to weigh that much at that point. That seems very odd, because normally all the blood coagulates, and then you go through rigor mortis and everything else. You become quite light. So that's really interesting too. As far as the wax, actually, a friend of mine called, was asking that same question. He said, "What about this wax that they always put over them?" It's a very common practice, and it's usually because of the darkening. Saint Rita of Kasha, I saw her. I believe she's incorrupt as well. I saw her there. I was kind of far away, but she had become very black. I mean, she died in the 1300s, and this was in a church, so they had candles going all the time. So the soot does start to collect and blacken too. So it's not uncommon practice to put the wax over it to stop that. I mean, this shouldn't shock people. I mean, even the Sistine Chapel was restored because of the same problem, because of the soot. But when they restored it, it was like, brand new. So
I wanted to ask you as well. I was speaking to a priest about this who was really, really excited about this discovery of Sister Wilhelmina, and she was the foundress of this order, as you mentioned, the Benedictines of Mary, Queen of Apostles, which is affiliated with the FSSP, and their liturgy centers on the traditional Latin Mass. In fact, she left her order at 50 years so that she could found this one, specifically because of her love for the traditional Latin Mass. And the priest was saying how excited he was that this was happening now, in light of Traditionis Custodes and the crackdown on the traditional Latin Mass. Do you think that's significant in any way?
Yes, I've had this conversation with other people too, so I'm glad this priest is also saying it. So I think this is on a lot of Catholics' minds. Yeah, the significance is quite stunning, actually, that here's this nun devoted to the traditional Latin Mass, the traditional Latin liturgy, which means they did the office in the old rite too, which is quite longer, and they chant it. So, but yeah, so I think that's quite significant. I also think it's significant that she's African American, because while while everyone's clamoring for restitution and all these other things, here's this actual black woman who lived a devout and holy life and was devoted to the traditional Latin Mass. I mean, she stands as a contradiction to shall we say, the left's narrative. So,
thanks.
William, always good to talk with you. You always have something good to say. And this time you've got some actually good news to share. So please, next time, do try to bring this, because all you ever turn up with is bad news. That's all we ever do, B. It's all we do. Anyway, B, wonderful to talk with you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahoney. All right, so relics. I'm sure we've all got plenty to talk about with regard to that. Who wants to lead off?
I'd like to go with the biblical focus first, just to get some, Protestants out there, or Catholics not really firm in their faith. Relics, sure, that's just kind of your personal faith and all that. Well, it's actually in the Bible. Acts. Let's go back to 4 Kings 13, 20, 21. Elisus was a very holy prophet, great man of God. He followed Elijah in his footsteps. He's the guy they're talking about here. It says Elisus died, and they buried him. And the rovers from Moab came into the land the same year, and some of them were burying a man, saw the rovers, and cast the body into the sepulchre of Elisus, where he had been buried. His bones were there. And when it touched the bones of Elisus, this man they just buried, the man came to life and stood on his feet. So here you have a raising from the dead story about how powerful the relics are. Now, bones in and of themselves don't do anything. Of course, it's always the power of God working through, but he chooses how and where and when he wants to work these miracles, and he has through relics. Let's go to the New Testament, because they might say, well, that's the Old Testament. Things have changed now. Well, Acts 19, 11 through 12. And God wrought by the hand of Paul, St. Paul the Apostle, more than common miracles, so that even there were brought from his body to the sick handkerchiefs and aprons, and the diseases departed from them, and the wicked spirits went out of them. So here you have what we would call second-class relics. The first one was the first-class relics, the bones of Elias. The second one was the second-class relics, things that have touched St. Paul's body are working these great miracles. Once again, God works the miracles, but he's choosing to do this to draw attention and focus to his own particular chosen vessel or instruments in their lifetime, Elias and in the New Testament, St. Paul. So, God's will be done, and that's what he chooses to work his miracles through, and that's what we call relics.
I want to return to the topic of incorruptibles. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Catholic faith, and I remember when I was coming back from Protestantism to the Catholic faith, it's something that I looked into, but There are many, many incorruptible saints in the church. You know, just to list a few: Saint Cecilia, Saint Francis Xavier, Pope Saint Pius V, Saint John Vianney, Saint Rita of Cascia, Blessed Maria of Agreda, Saint Joseph Avila, Saint John Bosco, Blessed Carlo Acutis, who's recent, Saint Catherine Labouré. Those are just a handful, and there's no scientific explanation for any of them. If anyone studies the decomposition of bodies, typically skeletonization, depending upon how humid or dry the place is, it can take, place after several weeks up to maybe a couple of years. But normally, bodies turn into skeletons after approximately a year. That's just the normal decomposition process. And these incorruptible saints defy that, some to a greater extent than others. I want to focus on one, Saint Bernadette of Soubirous. She's called the Sleeping Saint of Nevers. You can actually see a picture of her right here. She looks exactly like she looked the day that they took a photo of her when she died. She died in 1879. And of course, she's the saint to whom Our Lady of Lourdes appeared. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception came from that. And of course, we have the healing water of Lourdes from that as well. So many, many documented miracles from the healing baths of Lourdes. But this is actually very interesting. Her body was exhumed 30 years after her death, and she was buried in a very damp cemetery. So they expected her to be totally decomposed. She was not. Now, the fabric, just like with Sister Wilhelmina, the fabric of the coffin was completely decomposed. Her rosary, the metal on the rosary had so decomposed that it was rusted and the beads had broken off, but her body was completely supple, totally supple. And the church wanted to have a forensic scientist examine it just to make sure. And also, as an extra precaution to make sure that the public didn't think the church was like playing a trick on them, they actually had an atheist do it, just to make sure, okay, we're completely unbiased. And so they had the forensic scientist, an atheist, examine the body. He took down notes, and he said when he opened the abdomen, there was no odor of decomposition at all. In fact, no bodily odors at all. In fact, he said there was the scent of roses, which is sometimes typical with saints. He also said the liver, fresh blood dripped from the liver. So he concluded that there is no scientific explanation for this, and about a year later, he became a Catholic.
Okay.
He converted to the Catholic faith. But some of the skin is mummified, as you would expect, but most of the skin has remained on. There is a thin wax mask on her face. But again, these sorts of things defy scientific explanation. They're absolutely amazing.
Well, you take a look, you mentioned about the wax being placed over the face. Okay, well, of course that doesn't change the reality, because go take a raw steak from a store.
Yeah,
and put a little bit of wax over the top of it, and go leave it out in the hot sun and see what happens with that wax over time.
It's
just going to drip away from it.
Every single liberal Karen going there complaining about wax on uncorruptible saints needs to go and do a whole week without wearing makeup, and then we can talk.
And they'll be more corrupt than that. So. You also mentioned all the many saints who are incorruptible. Joan Carroll Cruz wrote a book, The Incorruptibles, and is available from TAN and other places. And that book there just goes through one after another, after another, after another. This is not a rare thing by any means. It's not happened all the time, but I mean, there's a lot of them that are really documented that are, you can find a whole list of them in there.
It's interesting when we talk about the incorruptibles, because of course you, Christine, said there's no scientific explanation for the incorruptibles within the Catholic faith, and of course there isn't. You've obviously got situations like Sister Wilhelmina where she wasn't embalmed, so there's nothing.
And she wasn't even in a vault. She was in a simple pine
sitting
box.
There, hey, I'm in a pine box in the water. I'm not embalmed. I should be, a skeleton within, a few months. But there are cases out there of non-Catholic attempts to create incorruptibles, or non-Catholic attempts to arrest the decomposition of the bodies, and they always fail. So we'll just go through a handful of these. There's obviously, first and foremost, the one that comes to mind is Egyptian mummification. Now, the mummification practice happens in Egypt because it's a very dry land, and the bodies dry very, very quickly. And so the mummification process is designed to actually make that more so and more intense. So they would actually remove some of the wetter organs. Sorry if you just had your dinner while you're listening to this. They would remove some of the wetter organs from the body and store those separately. The body would be dried out with special salts, and then the body is wrapped in resins and so forth. Well, if you've ever seen an Egyptian mummy, okay, that is not incorruptible. You know, that's obviously been sitting there, and they're kind of these dried, leathery, strange things. There are various monks within the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere, and they actually attempt a sort of self-mummification, where what they will actually do is they will, towards the end of their life, they will deliberately lose weight, deliberately dehydrate themselves, and will actually eat special berries and barks which contain toxins, so that actually it means that things will not eat them after their death. Insects won't eat them, of course. And again, certainly decay has been arrested, but it's nowhere near the level that we see with regard to the Catholic one. So again, you failed there, non-Catholic monks. And of course, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the commie in the mausoleum. Let's talk about Lenin, who was quite famously, they said, well, we're going to embalm Lenin as the great founder of the Soviet Union. We're going to do this. Well, okay, Lenin, as he lies there in his glass case now in the mausoleum, is like 70 to 80% wax and foam rubber and all that sort of stuff. And there's not a lot left of the original Lenin. You know, I think if the original Lenin had been made of wax and foam rubber, the world would have been a better place, but unfortunately not. He was a communist dude. But again, so you've got there's this idea out there, and I mention these examples because the idea of bodily decay is always seen as something very scary, something very frightening for people, and especially so if you don't have a hope of an eternal life. If you don't have a hope of a resurrection, if this is all you got, it's obviously very, very scary. And so the attempt to arrest that, the attempt to say, well, we want to stop this decay, obviously now you talk about people with plastic surgery and various treatments to make them live longer and so forth, but even after death we want to do it. And it's like, okay, you're doing this, and I understand why, but you are doing it completely the wrong way. All you had to do was become Catholic.
I did want to address, There were a couple of cases where they found some preserved bodies that were about 1,000 years old in some of the, I think, northern parts of Scotland. But there was a scientific explanation, because they were buried in these peat bogs, and it was the composition of the peat that preserved them. There's a scientific explanation for that. It's
incredibly acidic, and it's anaerobic. So what there is there's the peat bogs, the acid levels kill anything in there, and there's no oxygen in there. Right. So obviously there's no ability for things to decay. But even at that point, you see some of these peat bog bodies, and it's like, okay, dude, you do not look as good as Saint Bernadette. I mean, you could rub some wax on the dude you dug out of the peat bog, and it's like, you are not passing that off as a Catholic saint.
Right. No, I think this is one of the greatest examples of why Catholicism is just true. I don't know why we aren't talking about this kind of stuff more when we evangelize. There's nothing you can tell me that's going to explain why this happened, and we have all this evidence. Yeah, the atheist doctor, he's the one who looked into it. We have the account. Thousands of people saw the sun dance at Fatima. Why are these not some of the biggest evangelization tools that we're using? And I've never heard any Protestants talk about this stuff. I don't know if the pastors that are there are just purposely staying away from it, because I've never had anyone come up to me and talk about an incorruptible, or even relics themselves. I've never had any Protestants talk to me about relics. And I think that if I was not Catholic, that would be the craziest thing to me, is you guys have bones of people just laying around that. To me, that would be one of the biggest off-putting things. Okay, I understand, you pray to them, you think they can do stuff for you, but you keep their bones?
Yeah.
The holier you are, the more they chop you up.
Correct. And as a former Protestant, that Protestants cannot explain relics. And also, Protestants don't understand this. They actually have inherited the heresy of dualism, also Manichaeanism, Platonism. There is. I mean, I kind of believe this, that the spirit is holy, but the flesh is evil. Matter is corrupt. And you'd separate the two. And when you die, it's the spirit that goes. And you really do believe that. I mean, as a Protestant, I never thought about the resurrection. I never thought that the resurrection was the uniting of the physical body with the soul. You just don't think of the body, the human person, as a composite of body and soul. You think primarily spirit, flesh is bad, flesh is bad. And again, they don't understand. This is a heresy, heresy of Manichaeanism. And as we know, the body is good. God made the flesh good. And the holier you are, the more you follow God's will, the more God's life lives in you and sanctifies your body, such that saints are walking mirrors, essentially, of God, so that God's imprint, His holiness, is on their bodies. It's an amazing thing, and Protestants they don't have anything they don't understand that.
You have a hard time at nighttime. They turn the light out in the bedroom and it kind of still glows. I have to kind of cover myself up to people get a good night's sleep.
That's because you spend all that time at Chernobyl, though. That's the problem.
It's even amazing some of the things that God lets happen with the body that are just so unexplainable. Like saints who just for years live on just the Eucharist or things like that. Like even then, the body has this such significance, and God can bring it to further bounds than nature normally affords it, with just letting us live on so little, and just the sacrifices people make and still are able to live, because the body is something that's good. It has to be because of concupiscence. We have to subject it more hardly to our will now. Like our reason, our intellect should always be the guiding factor, and because of concupiscence, our body wants to go the opposite way of which it should, which is why subjecting it to harsher things sometimes, like fasting and just things like that, especially fasting is one of the biggest things talked about. Like the just going away from gluttony, something that the saints talk about. A lot of the saints talk about. That's the first thing you have to conquer, is things like gluttony or things like lust, in order to become holy. These things with the body to help put the body back in its proper place.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say that, so speaking about fasting, we actually, in the old calendar, we've got the Ember Days this week. Now, the Ember Days, of course, have sort of fallen by the wayside in the modern calendar, but obviously there's still a practice that you can do, and then you would obviously be in union with a long-standing tradition of the church. These are days of fasting, and obviously now in the church, in sort of the modern calendar, there are only like a couple of days of fasting throughout the year. And we obviously have abstinence and so forth that we're practicing on Fridays, particularly Fridays of Lent. Shout out to the Holy Mackerel there, trying to do his best. But what you've got is you've got these great opportunities to not only just say, today I'm going to fast because I feel like it today, but today I'm going to fast because it's an Ember Day, because it's a day of fasting within the church's tradition, and that unifies you with all of these other saints who've come forward.
The other thing that the Catholics do that's different than all the other not denominations, but other branches of Christianity,
fallen away, separated brethren,
is we have Jesus on the cross. His body is on the cross. We call it a crucifix. We don't just call it a cross. And it's that body through which he became incarnate, that he actually suffered and died for our sins so that we can go to heaven. And it's incredible. You get to think about that for a minute. That body, he didn't have to take on a body really to redeem us. He could have done it some other way, I suppose. But the fact that he did choose to take on a body, we call it the incarnation, taking on the flesh, really puts an exclamation mark, on the body, that he thought so much of that 2,000 years ago we actually took on the divine person from all eternity. 2,000 years ago took on a human nature, a body and soul in the womb of Mary. And the importance that he puts on the body for us in working out our salvation. You talked about fasting and mortification and that type of thing. St. Thomas also talks about, of course, we sin through the body, but we also receive the sacraments through the body. And the body says necessary for the action of the intellect and the mind. So we're not just these angelic beings down here. We actually have to operate and act through our body, which gives us all that resistance. So the body's incredibly, and St. Thomas, again, nothing in that mind which isn't first in the senses. I have to have sense knowledge that I can then put into my intellect and chew on it for a while. So the whole idea that this body is so central to our salvation, starting from Christ all the way and how he worked out the economy of salvation for us, extremely important. It ties in exactly with the relics. I mean, he's pointing to the fact that the bodies of these saints, they use their bodies well.
Yes, and they use their bodies to be saved. I think if you think about like all the possible sins that you can commit, you could say, okay, well, here are the 10 Commandments and how can I violate them? Or you say, here are the capital vices and what can I do? And then you think about all of the virtues. You think about the great virtues that you can practice, and try to think, how many of those can you do without your body? even the ones that we purely think are like purely intellectual. So you think, okay, well, like you might think, well, I've harbored hatred or lust in my heart. Okay, well, it didn't actually happen in your heart. It happened in your mind, and which happened in your brain, which is a physical thing. I mean, this is, if you think about it, we often like to imagine that our thoughts and our considerations and all of the stuff that we're doing intellectually is occurring purely in our soul. It's purely detached from our body, but I assure you that it isn't. And you can tell that because of, by observing people who've been injured. So I studied English language at university, and one of the most useful tools for discussing how people process language in the brain is actually studying people who've had damage to their brains. But if you have someone who's had damage to their brain through trauma or anoxia or disease or something, well, okay, they suffer a failure of intellectual capacity. A lack of knowledge or a lack of memory, a lack of ability to process things quickly. Well, okay, that's a damage to the brain, a physical thing showing that your intellect is really, a lot of that is within the body. You know, we talk about people who, oh, he's obviously got a big brain, so he's intelligent. He's an intelligent fellow because his brain is large. And that's what we talk about. So yeah, all of the sins and all of the virtues, when we talk about like, oh, this is a virtuous act, to bury the dead, to console the doubtful. Okay, how are you consoling the doubtful? You're patting them on the shoulder, you're saying kind words. Those are physical things. How are you counseling the ignorant? How are you, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked? Well, all of these are physical things. All of the sins are physical. All of the virtues are physical. So our bodies are absolutely essential.
And there's a mysterious interplay between matter and the spirit. And like I said before, Protestants tend to spiritualize everything, right? With Catholics, both are necessary. How do we receive the sacraments? The sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. The Holy Eucharist comes into us through the host. Physically, obviously, it's a sacred mystery. It's our Lord's body, blood, soul, and divinity. But he's received physically into our bodies, not just to purify our souls, but also to purify our bodies. It's our Lord's DNA mingling with our DNA, divinizing us in a sense. And, Holy Communion is not just there to prepare our souls to be in the presence of God. It's there to prepare our bodies also to be in the presence of God. And Protestants don't have this. They spiritualize everything. They don't have the Eucharist. So for them, it's just, you don't really need to go to church. You can just pray in your spirit at home. You're fine. You don't need to go to a Catholic priest in the confessional, and he doesn't have to, pray. You can just ask for forgiveness in your heart, and it's fine. Everything is just spiritual. They don't have this theology of some places are more sacred than others. Some, as we believe, certain areas are made sacred. The physical area is actually sacred ground, maybe because our Lord had been there, or the blood of the martyrs has spilled on that ground, but some places are more sacred than others. Protestants don't have that at all. They lack that entirely.
Yeah, Jesus is just everywhere. I'm always in the presence of God, which is, somewhat true, but I am definitely substantially more in the presence of God when the tabernacle's right there,
which is also
and he's in it.
Correct, which is also one of the reasons why a lot of Protestants banned feast days, because they said every single day is the same, no day is holier than another. We don't have high holy days, it's too papist, and so every single day was the same, including Christmas. It's very interesting. Yeah, everything's just sort of spiritualized, and in a sense, the mystery and the wonder and the awe of the world, according to the Catholic worldview, is just completely, it's taken out.
Yeah, you sort of reduce it almost to like that sense of the participation trophy. It's like, well, nobody's special, so everyone's special, so nobody's special. It's that, we're just going to make everything just like completely flat in that sense.
And whenever you kind of raise up one above the other and forget about the other, it makes both fall apart. So whenever you only focus on the spirit, the body falls apart, which in turn, because they're supposed to work together, makes the spiritual side fall apart as well, which is, you have to not only take care of your spiritual needs, but your physical needs. We're body and soul composite. So it is just as important and just as virtuous to focus on making your body healthy. And so it's not not this unhealthy nature, which we've seen now. Like we have one of the opposite extremes where everything is just, oh, we'll just go pray and be spiritual, blah, blah, blah. Or it's like, dude, you don't need anything, just like go to the gym and like just this total like glorific idolatry of the body, basically, like where we think of the body as an idol. And it's like neither of those. There is a very healthy medium where you have to be focusing on both if you want to be a fully integrated person and to become a saint, because none of the saints were spending 3 hours in the gym all day, but none of them were also just sitting around doing nothing all day either. Even the religious orders now that are heavily contemplative, there's still like this 30 minutes, hour set apart for like recreation during the day, because they realize the body has these different needs which are very good, which help it to become holy.
Yeah, and returning to the topic of relics too, which again I think is one of the coolest parts of Catholicism, cool aspects of Catholicism. We believe, of course, that because of the saint's holiness in life, in death, their body still retains that holiness. And so when you have that relic, there is grace attached, and grace can be imparted from that relic. So relics have been known to miraculously heal people if you touch them. For instance, the true cross has miraculously healed people, things like that. And I wanted to share something very cool anecdote from an exorcist, Father Carlos Martins, because he also, his main apostle is actually traveling the country and traveling the world with this exhibition of thousands of relics, which the Vatican entrusted to him. He's one of the few people in the world who actually knows how to prepare relics. I think only 20 people in the world who know how to actually officially prepare the relics in the casing and all that stuff. He can do that. And so he will travel around showing, it's called the treasuries of the church. But he also is an exorcist, and he uses relics in his ministry. They're very powerful. Just one really, really cool anecdote that I heard in the Exorcist Files, which everyone needs to listen to. It's an excellent podcast series, which so far has gotten 2 million downloads. It's amazing. A really great catechetical tool. But there was an exorcist friend of his who was dealing with a very difficult saint. It was a person who was afflicted demonic possession, and he was manifesting in these. And so, of course, one of the things the exorcist does is he asks for the name of the demon, because when you ask for the name, it gives you authority and power. So the demons always resist for a long time until finally they weaken, they give the name, and the demon said his name was Murder. And this priest asked, okay, who was your arch nemesis? Because that's another thing Father Martins does, is he tries to find out who their arch nemesis was, because if you can get a relic of that saint, it's extremely powerful. Now, again, this demon didn't want to say who it was, and then finally, after he was, weakened enough, he spat out the name Thomas. And the exorcist says, okay, so he's thinking, okay, it's either Thomas the Apostle or Thomas Aquinas. So he's saying, which Thomas? And then the demon said, with expletives, Becket. Thomas Becket.
Okay.
And so at the end of the session, because these sessions, they tend to, there are multiple sessions.
That is an appropriate name for a demon, isn't it, as well, after poor Becket got done.
Well, it's very interesting, because Father Martins actually FedExed to this priest a relic of St. Thomas Becket. As we know, he was murdered it was actually a very brutal murder. There were 4 knights who surrounded him, and they each, with a stroke of a sword, cut at his head. It was actually the 4th stroke of the sword that cut off the top, the tonsure, essentially, of his head. His brains were scattered all over the floor. But he had a relic of the blood-stained alb of St. Thomas Becket. He sent that to the exorcist. The exorcist comes in, starts a new session. Demon is acting up and being difficult. He takes out the relic, and he said, this demon went absolutely insane. He was freaking out, desperate to get away. And he said the way he responded to it was as if Thomas Becket was standing there fully in his person, and he was screaming to get away. And it turns out the exorcist found out that this particular demon had actually possessed the knight who dealt the death blow to St. Thomas Becket more than 1,000 years earlier. It was the same demon. And because of St. Thomas Becket's very holy death, he is now his arch nemesis with great power over him. I thought that was such a cool story. And of course, the person was freed of demonic possession after that, very quickly after that.
Catholicism's cool.
It is. It's really cool. It's so cool.
There's your statement on that one.
So relics do come up in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. We throw it in there. 1674, paragraph 1674. Schoenborn did give one little line in there when he wrote the Catechism under John Paul II. God bless him. Besides sacramental liturgy, now we're talking about a whole incarnation incarnational church. Christ is the incarnate Godhead of the church. Mystical body would also follow that in this incarnate nature, this material spiritual combination. Besides sacramental liturgy and sacramentals, we talk about sacramentals like a blessed medal or a blessed statue, that type of thing. Catechesis must take into account, because you talk about how come we don't use this to evangelize. Well, there's a little bit of it in the catechism here. Catechesis must take into account the forms of piety and popular devotion among the faithful. The religious sense of the Christian people has always found expression in various forms of piety surrounding the church's sacramental life, such as the veneration of relics, saying that's always been part and parcel of the Christian cult or worship. Visits to sanctuaries, pilgrimages, processions, the Stations of the Cross, religious dances, rosary medals, etc. And that's kind of the problem right there. When you throw relics in with all that other incarnational stuff, it just becomes kind of washed out. And that's where I would fault Schoenborn in his presentation of some of these supernatural dogmatic type things. Now, the morals seem to be a little bit more stronger in the catechism. Some of these things here probably could have been presented a little bit more with clarity, I think there. But the idea that it is there, they are saying that we should use those. But the takeaway here is this incarnational aspect of Holy Mother Church. Follows, she's the bride that follows the groom there, who is the incarnational head of that mystical body. So you would imagine that if Christ is going to go so far as to take on a body, that he would, and his church that he establishes would also have some incarnational earthy type things like sacraments received through the body and relics being venerated and actually useful in bringing grace to people and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
So possibly the earliest account we really see with the saints of the early church, because it was something that the church fathers did talk about. So Polycarp was one of the first ones we see with that. In 156, they're writing about him. So he was burned at the stake, and then it's written, "We took up his bones, which are more valuable than precious stones and finer than refined gold, and laid them in a suitable place where the Lord will permit us to gather ourselves together as we are able in gladness and joy, and to celebrate the birthday of his martyrdom." So they're talking about having a place set aside for his bones, which they so highly venerate, and they're going to visit them often, especially on his martyrdom, and to pray to God using those, because they know the saint, even with the saint gone now physically, and the still parts of the body there, and they're able to use those to help in prayer, to still ask the Lord for favor, even though the saint himself is no longer with them, able to do those works and miracles that he would have done in his life. His bones still have power if the Lord allows it.
Yeah, that's where the God himself is very common sense, that he would point arrows at all these individuals like he did with Moses and like Elias and stuff. Point arrows at these and say, look at them, what they did. That's me talking here. And you want to know what God's like? Well, listen to what his saints had to say. Catechism of the Catholic Church 1475 says, in the communion of saints, Polycarp and Apostle and St. Paul and all these, in the communion of saints, a perennial link of charity exists between the faithful who have already reached their heavenly home, such as Polycarp, St. Paul, those who are expiating their sins in purgatory, and those who are still pilgrims on earth, such as ourselves. Between them, there is too an abundant exchange of all good things. Once again, Schoenborn could have been using the word grace. Okay, thank you. Good things such as grace that you receive, temporal and actual, and to actually help you become more holy, to aid you and assist you, like in the exorcism there's grace there that the demon is responding to and helping to overcome, driving out the demon there. The St. Paul talks about these napkins and the diseases are parting, and you're getting grace, supernatural help here in your journey along. We call that grace, Schoenborn. Thank you. And
the saints even knew this. Like Therese talks about how she's going to spend her eternity doing more good on earth.
Yes.
Than she was already. So she's able to, there's relics of her all over the place. And what good are they doing? Even the saints recognize this, that they will have this ability to still help others while in heaven, and even some in more such a way, because they're only in one location. They can only be in really one location unless they bilocate while they're here. But now in heaven, they can help out anyone in any corner of the world.
Right. And saints glorify God. They magnify his goodness and his greatness. That's another, something else to come back at Protestants who object to this because they think, oh, well, that takes away from the glory of God. Only God does these things. You can't venerate these saints because and it's like, no, do your children, when they achieve great success, does that detract from your glory as a parent? No, it magnifies it. You're proud of them. You want to, show them and all that stuff. Well, how much more the saints who are the children of God? They greatly magnify and glorify God's goodness and his love. But just kind of returning to Protestantism and their problem with the matter, versus the spirit.
I'm so glad that you, as the ex-Protestant, is the one dogging on Protestantism here.
No,
I feel so much better about that, Christy.
I studied Calvinist theology very deeply. I was a Calvinist, and of course, Calvinists believe in total depravity, meaning you are completely and utterly depraved. Only Christ's blood saves you. Martin Luther said, I am simply a dunghill covered in snow. To the very end of my life, that's what I really am. To my core, I'm totally corrupt, totally depraved, and that it's only Christ's righteousness that essentially puts a veil over me, and that's what God sees when he looks at me. And it's like, okay, yes, we are corrupt, but according to the Catholic faith, like we said earlier, God is also purifying and divinizing your material body, your physical body. It's not just the spirit. So if you understand Protestant theology, the fact that, no, I'm totally corrupt and everything is just Christ's righteousness and it's the spirit that's being rejuvenated, you better understand why it is they don't care if Mary was sinful or not. Because they're like, well, she was just a receptacle and she was just as corrupt as the rest of us. She just housed God, but God was just there spiritually. It's like, wait a second, no, he developed physically the way any baby develops. He took his blood from her. He took his DNA, not his DNA, but he took his genetic material, he took his blood, he took his nourishment. It all came from her physically. And that matters. That matters. You can't have the corrupt going into the incorrupt, which is why it was necessary for her to be totally sinless.
Yeah, I think it's something that we should talk about. Sort of we're getting towards the last 10, 15 minutes of the show. Something we should talk about, and it's a perennial problem for a lot of Catholics, including one in New York who wears red, is kind of the bloody grotesquerie of relics. So when the whole matter of Sheen's, Fulton Sheen's canonization came up, and this whole thing, Cardinal Dolan out of New York was saying, I forget his exact words, but it was basically, and you remember his exact words, but it was pretty close to him just saying, look, this whole carving bodies up, that's kind of grotesque. And it's like, bro, do you even Catholic? I mean, it's like we're not going to sit there and just go with a bunch of butcher knives and just hack this guy up like he's a mob hit and we're going to dump him in the Hudson. But I mean, we're not going to do that. This is go in and you extract relics reverently, and you do for the veneration of the faithful. It's a thing that's been done since Polycarp, But again, there may be Catholics out there who've kind of got a difficulty with that. I mean, what can we say?
Yeah, the corporal works of mercy we talked about there. Also, you talk about the Protestants, how they have a dim view of the body, and you bring those together, and you start looking. Okay, the Catholic Church, apart from the government, the Catholic Church has more hospital beds, has more schools, has more corporal works of mercy to alleviate the sufferings and the pains in other people than by any means whatsoever. All the denominations of Protestantism combined, you start stacking up the missionary work that was done in the past to go to foreign countries and not just convert souls to the Catholic Church, but to do what Mother Teresa did, taking bodies off of the streets because they were precious people. Their body and soul composite there. So the facts of the statistics would show that all the corporal works of mercy that the Catholic Church as an institution has done, stacked up to all other branches of Christianity and all other religions combined, just is off the chart with regard to the number of schools and hospitals. Most of those are all becoming secular now and being sold off and bought out and closing because of all the teaching orders and stuff like that in the recent times. But that's like looking at the last couple rings in a tree, It's got this huge oak tree with massive rings, and it's ancient, and then you look at the last few rings on that tree. It doesn't tell the whole story about that. So
Yeah, that's the saddest part, is the fact that these things have become exclusively about the bodily presence of people, like just the teaching of children basic skills of reading and writing in schools or in hospitals. It's all about healing just the body. They have lost that spiritual connection in all the senses in a lot of ways now, and so that we've gotten away from the actual part where it's like, no, we're trying to bring you, most of all, we're trying to save your soul, but we realize that your body is important in that matter, and so we've lost the whole point of saving the soul now. Now we're just like, oh, if they end up going to church, maybe that'll happen, or go receive the sacrament somewhere else. But we've taken that part out in these later years.
Mother Teresa brings that very point out right there. We mentioned this before in some download wherever, but when she was asked by the government to have her sisters train government social workers to do what she's doing out there, she says, I can't. Because when she picked up a body off the street, she saw that it was Christ, that he said, what you do for the least member, you do to me. I thirst is what she's hearing. So she's actually doing it for a very supernatural reason. That's the motivation. That actually gets the person to be able to put up with the heat, the suffering, the stench, the problems, and all the problems that go with all of that, that you can't get that imparted to just a secular non-believing person to go out and do those things. Like, how do you do this? Well, we're doing it for God. We're doing it for Christ. We're doing it with the power given us also by Christ. So it's supernatural work for a supernatural end. And she couldn't impart that to just secular people.
And that's why we do it so crappily nowadays. Like, you see all these nursing home stories or all these other places where it's like these people aren't being taken care of well. We've seen it as just a way to make money or things like that. We've totally devoided it of the supernatural end of man, to where we're not actually taking care of these people in a lot of ways. Like, they're coming out and they're either depressive, they're not Catholic, whatever. Like, these people aren't going to schools and becoming good Catholics. We're not looking at the student as Jesus, who needs to be brought along. We're not looking at the old person as Christ, that we need to take care of in these final years of their life. We've totally devoided that supernatural end, which is why we're failing at a lot of these works of mercy in the secular and even now in the religious world.
I wanted to come back to the topic of relics, once again foreseeing objections from Protestants, because I want to talk about the scriptural aspect of relics. You mentioned the bones of Elijah, right, being used to bring a man back to life, but we have other examples from scripture as well. We've got St. Peter. It says in Acts 5:14, when his shadow passed over the sick, they were healed. Simply a shadow. We also have St. Paul. Handkerchiefs, aprons were carried away from his body to the sick, and then they were healed, or demons were cast out. You have the woman who was afflicted with a hemorrhage coming and touching the hem of our Lord's cloak. In fact, what's very interesting is the way that the relic of the true cross was found. St. Helen, who was the mother of Constantine. Well, what's interesting is she was sort of given an understanding of where to find the relics. And so they dug. But they actually found lots and lots of little crosses, and they had to figure out which one was true and which one was fake.
Because they crucified a lot of people on that hill.
Yeah. So she said, okay, well, this is what we'll do. We will take the sick person. We will carry the sick person from one cross to another, and whichever one heals the sick person is the true cross. That's exactly what they did. They took the sick person from cross to cross. There was one cross where this person was healed instantly. That's an example of a relic. But like I said, if Protestants out there want to object to this, it is scriptural.
I think as well, speaking about, I'm glad you brought up the true cross, because this is actually an objection that comes up from Protestants, atheists, and this sort of stuff. Well, they'll actually come along and they'll say, yeah, if you gather together all the fragments of the true cross, you could make 50 crosses, each big enough to bear a giant. That is a lie. The largest piece of the true cross that I've ever seen was about the size of a matchstick, and that is big for the size of a piece of the true cross. The large piece was, of course, lost at the Battle of Hatton, the Battle of the Horns of Hatton during the Crusades. But I have heard that your average Roman cross was maybe about 10 cubic feet olive wood. We have less than 3 feet, less than 3 cubic feet if you gather them all together, all of the fragments of the true cross. And even back in the days of Helena, it wasn't like, hey, it wasn't like she dug it out and here's the cross and it looks just like it's there. No, it was, damaged and had been churned up in the ground and so forth. So another thought, and this is one that will potentially start a great argument, which is why I'm starting it towards the end. So there are the 3 classes of relic, okay? There is, and this is a good one. So there is the first class relic, which is the actual body of the person. Most often it's bone, but sometimes you might get blood or hair or skin tissue or something like that. I've actually seen the pericardium of John Paul II. That is the sac that encloses the heart. I have seen that. I've held that in my hand. And that's pretty cool. But obviously that is a first class relic. Then there is a second class relic, which is a thing that the saint used during their life. So a walking stick or a habit or a book or something like that. Then there is a third class relic, and a third class relic is something that has been touched to a first class relic. So often when you will get a relic of a saint, it's a tiny piece of cloth and it's been touched to a bone. Okay, here is the question and the argument to start. You are a person living in the 20th or 21st century, and you have suffered, as people do as they get older, a damage or just general wear and tear in your hip joints. And your hip joint has been replaced with the titanium replacement. So you have an artificial hip, as many people do. Surely some of our audience have artificial hips or other artificial limbs or something like that. You die, and you are declared a saint. The titanium appliance, first, second, or third class relic? Go.
That's a good question.
Second.
Why?
Second. Something he used.
I think it wasn't their original body. I think you'd have to.
Oh, so you would go for original.
I think it'd be use of the. I think it'd be something they used later on in life or something. I would go with second.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you would go with second.
That would probably be second class, yeah. The other, we also talked about the resurrection of the body. All this has to do with God, venerating the body of saints. And everybody, we believe in the resurrection of the body, of course. And that body actually has qualities. We didn't mention that one yet. Those 4 qualities of a risen body. This is how far God has thought things through, what he wants to do in his plan for us. And it's been Catholic teaching, I've been mentioned in the Council of Trent, it came in the Catechism of Trent, that there is clarity, the brightness that comes out, that it was shown at the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor. Also, Moses had that illumination in his face when he beheld God, and he had put the veil over his face. The subtlety, being able to pass through. Jesus was able to pass through the stone of the tomb, pass through the doors were locked for fear of the Jews, and he stood within their midst, so he was able to pass through there. The agility, be able to travel at the speed of thought, wherever you need to be. And then impassibility, you're not going to suffer anymore. There's no more suffering in that body. So those are the 4 qualities that we have of a risen body. So God has thought this all the way through, what he actually wants to do with those risen bodies of the saints. And unfortunately, if you're going to hell, you won't have any of those qualities.
Yeah, and it's not going to be pleasant.
It's not going to be pleasant, but therefore, once again, you're punished in the body in which you sinned.
Yes.
You're glorified in the body in which you were saved in. So it's biblical, it's scriptural, historical. Bodies of saints are real.
And last little note, just fun quick tip, because this is the last thing that I have in mind. So as we know, I think most people know, but if you don't, relics are in altars in churches, and so there are relics inside of whatever altar you use at your church, and that's where the origin of the priest kissing the altar came from, is him asking for the intercession of those saints, which their relics are housed within the altar. So nice little cool thing. Yeah,
and that of course is where Mass would originally be said. Initially, they would be saying Mass in the catacombs, where at the tombs of the Catholics who'd gone before them. That's the whole thing with Polycarp. So they're gathering those there, and then they used to say they gathered together. Well, certainly they're gathering together for Mass. They're not just getting there for the Wednesday night casserole swap meet.
Yeah, and that happened for a few hundred years. So
yeah,
it's all
their long tradition. All right, well, thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Download. Hopefully it has been educational and interesting for you. Now, please join us as we finish in prayer, begging Our Lady's intercession for our nation and our church. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Spirit.
Amen.
Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo et spes nostra salve. A te clamamus exules filii Eve, a te suspiramus gementes et flentes, in hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, ilos tuos misericordes oculos ad nos converte, et Iesum benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc exilium ostende, o clemens, o pia, o dulcis Virgo Maria.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thank you again for joining us for The Download. We premiere a new episode like this every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And of course, all of the episodes are available on the website for you to watch whenever you like. From all of us here at Church Milton, thank you for tuning in. May God bless you.